Les voy a explicar rápidamente cómo funciona la traducción para los que van a necesitar traducción simultánea. El idioma es inglés. Elías Jalabe es el traductor. Pongan atención cómo funciona. En la parte de abajo, en su pantalla tienen un icono de un mundo, ¿ok? Que dice interpretación o traducción. Le van a picar y van a poner los que quieran escuchar a Rav Jeffrey directamente, van a poner English, ¿ok? Con que pongan English o inglés, van a escuchar a Rav Jeffrey. Los que pongan Spanish, pongan mute original audio, o sea, silenciar el audio original para que puedan escuchar solamente al traductor. Si quieren escuchar a Rav Jeffrey y al traductor al mismo tiempo, ponen Spanish sin mute original audio, ¿ok?
No, yo en una hora, pero si comen ya, yo como después.
Y los que quieran, entonces ya, con eso es suficiente. Los que quieran escuchar a Jeffrey directamente inglés, los que quieran escuchar en la traducción pongan Spanish y también pongan mute original, o sea, silenciar el audio original, ¿ok? Toda la barra Jeffrey, בבקשה, אתה יכול להתחיל.
Una pregunta.
Sí.
¿Alguien tiene una pregunta o algo? ¿Es algún problema si está en español y silenciado o algo? O...
¿En qué estás tú ahorita?
Yo en español, porque yo no, inglés no es muy fuerte.
No, puedes preguntar. ¿Está bien? Perfecto. Rob Jeffrey no te va a escuchar si tú estás en español, pero entonces lo vas a pasar a inglés y preguntas en hebreo. Rob Jeffrey, אם יהיו שאלות הם יכולים לשאול אותך, נכון? באמצע. Okay.
Okay, so hi everybody. It occurs to me that first of all, thank you very much, Rabbi Mehta. I'm really happy to be here. It's nice to see Semi. Semi, your beard got longer. I didn't have a chance, by over here in Mexico it's 4:30, here it's 12:30, so it hit me when I was putting on a tie at 11 o'clock at night. My wife was asking me, what are you doing? That I wasn't able to give a shiur in the middle of the night on Shavuot, and I wasn't able to do it on Hoshana Rabbah either, which I usually do. So you're the you are the makeup for those two late night shiurim. Rabbi Mehta asked me to give you 3 talks on various aspects of psika. Those parts that are not connected with the things that are obvious to you, which are if a person wants to learn how to decide sheilot, then you have to know Shas and Poskim. That's very simple. I mean, it's not very simple to do, but the answer is very simple. But there are other parts of psika, especially today, which I want to call your attention to. Some of them will be obvious, but sometimes you have to state the obvious in order to be able to really understand what they're about. Some will be less obvious. And while every single talk has a specific title, today it's a matter of what else does a posek need to know. Next week we'll talk about methodologies of psika in the modern age or the postmodern age. And then the third section we'll talk about Rav Soloveitchik. The truth of the matter is that when I started putting them together, I realized that there's going to be a lot of overlap and we're going to be going back and forth. It's what the Meiri always calls a derech hagilgul. The things come up and they so in any case, we're going to try to, I'm going to focus on emphasize the topic for today, which is what does a posek need to know, but we're going to start actually with a couple of other things which I think are necessary before we get to that. And since I had a cup of coffee 20 minutes ago, I mean, so I'm good. So as far as I'm concerned, I know people's biorhythms go down at 4:30. You might be actually in worse shape than I am. Okay, let's start with the, let me put up the sources on the screen. Okay. I've gotten to be a real, expert on this since I've been teaching on this past, since last March. Okay, I want to start with the Mishnah and Tanit. Mishnah and Tanit, Higia Shiva, the first parak in Tanit talks about the special Taniot that were held for rain in Eretz Yisrael. Happily, this year we do not have that problem. On the contrary, we just had a downpour this afternoon that shook the windows, and it is very likely that the Kinneret will be so full by the end of this winter that they're going to have to open up the what's called Secher Deganya, the Deganya Dam, and finally put some water into the Jordan, and more importantly, put it into Yam HaMelech. But there are certainly times that we lack rain in Eretz Yisrael, and Chazal organized a system of Taniot. I'm not. This is nothing new to you, but I want to carefully read one Mishnah. If the 17th of Mar Cheshvan arrives, notice this is 10 days after we start Shelat Kshamim. You start Shelat Kshamim on the 4th or the 5th of December. We start already 2 weeks after Sukkot. So if 10 years after you start saying, Tein Talo Matal Levracha, V'lo Yarduk Kshamim, Hitchilu HaYechidim Metanim Shalosh Taniot. Yechidim quietly start fasting. Okay. Okay. So the question is, who are the Yechidim? So that's on Daf Yud Amud Aleph, Daf Yud Amud Bet. At the top of the page, the Gemara brings a Braita, Tanu Rabbanan, Al Yomar Adam Talmidani, Eini Ro'oi Liot Yechid, Ela Kol Talmidei Chachamim Yechidim. First of all, when it comes to something for the community, there's no room for humility. If you are qualified to participate in these fasts, you don't start saying, "Who am I? I'm a nobody." You have to take your responsibility seriously, and you have to fast. And then the Braita, we'll come back to that. And then the Braita goes on and says, "Okay, but who are we talking about? Who's the Yachid? Ezehu Yachid ve'ezehu Talmid. What's the difference between a Yachid and a Talmid? Yachid is kol shira'ui l'manoto parnas al tzibur. Talmid, anybody who is worthy of being appointed to a position of authority in the community. Talmid, kol sheshoa limoto dvar halacha betalmudo va'omer va'afilu b'masechet dekala. Anybody who is so who's bekiyut, whose breadth of knowledge is so broad that he can ask whatever you want, even in the Masechet Dekala. Now, there's a machloket rishonim as regard to what that means. So Tosfot on the spot say that here, even the guy that Masechet Kala is actually talking about a person. It's either Masechet Kala, the little Masechet in the Masechtot Kedanot, or it means a person who knows the Masechta that they're learning at the time. Masechta de Kala is in what yeshiva you learn ex Masechta, that's what you're learning. But he's not a person of tremendous breadth. The Ritva, and this is the position the interpretation was preferred by Rav Soloveitchik, at least when I learned Tanit with him, takes a different position. He says, no, a person who's a Talmud is a person of is a tremendous Talmud Chacham. He not only knows Shas and Poskim, he even knows all these little books, right? He knows all the stuff in the back, in the small print in the back of the Shas. He knows Masachet Kalan, Masachet Sofrim, and Masachet Mezuzah, and whatever you want over it. And that's a Talmid. That's a Talmid. So Rav Soloveitchik said, well, why? So that's a pretty, if we go with the Ritva, then that's why call him a Talmid. He's a pretty singular, important individual. You're talking about a person who's a very learned person. So what divides the a Yachid and a Talmid? So Yachid, says the Gemara, would apparently, it has nothing to do with this. This is Kol Shira'ui L'Manoto Parnas Al Tzibur. Anyone who's worthy of occupying a communal position. Now, the truth of the matter is, in our life, if anything, the two don't go together. I mean, rabbis and balabatim. It's not sometimes it's a happy story, but sometimes it's not such a happy story. So why, so the Yechidim are mitanim, what are we talking about? So Rav Soloveitchik said that no, a Yachid is a specific type of person who starts off as a Talmid, but he has certain qualities which take him beyond that, which sort of put him a leg up, make him superior to the average tremendous Talmid Chacham. And what is that? So he at the time said that that what it takes to be a rabbinic leader is gvura. It's not enough to know; you also have to have a backbone. You also have to be able to develop your positions and be strong, and take your knowledge and apply it without any fear. So that's number one. However, so in other words, Yachid, there's a Gemara in Shabbat that has a different position on this, but this seems to be the pshat in Tanit. In other words, Yachid builds on Talmid. So number one quality in terms of being involved in psak is the ability, is the courage to be able to paskin. Now that has two ends to it. Part of all is, first of all, that means dealing with people. And number two, as we'll see, is the very act of psika requires a tremendous amount of moral and religious and spiritual strength. But there's more to it than that. Look, let's go back to the Mishnah. Higia shivasar, I was going to say shivasar b'tammuz. Higia shivasar b'merchashavan v'lo yadu gshamim hitchilu hayechidim metanim shalosh taniyot. The Mishnah doesn't say that there's a chovah on the yechidim to fast. The Mishnah says that the yechidim fast on their own. They used to start that way. What do you see from that? No, not the Rav. I'm adding. This is my addition. You see that one of the other characteristics that characterize it, that qualifies a yachid, is the fact that they are sensitive to the needs of the community. Once they're not often an ivory tower. The minute that 10 days goes by, from the time that they start saying Tein Talum Matalev Racha in Eretz Yisrael, and there's no rain, on their own, because they realize what the tzorchei tzibur are, they will take it upon themselves to fast, whether anybody told them or not. So, if a yachid is a person shekol shera'ui lamanoto parnas al tzibur, it's not just a person who can stare down and can argue and can fight with the tzibur. It's a person who's ra'ui lamanoto parnas al tzibur because he's sensitive to the needs of the tzibur. Betoch amohu yoshev. So those are two characteristics that a posek needs to develop on his own. It's one thing he has to know about himself, or a rav of any kind, before he starts paskening. So that's point number one. Now, point number two comes to one of the other parts of the gevurah that we're talking about, and this is the Gemara which pops up in Sota, it pops up in Sanhedrin, it's quoted all over the place. About the fact that when you really paskin a shayla, guy comes up to you and says, I forgot to say atachanun tanu on Motzei Shabbat. Do I have to say, do I have to daven again with stuff like that? That's not a psak. That's you read the art scroll. That's you take a look at it. That's not even birur hadin. That's whatever it is. We're talking about serious psak and by the way, serious psak doesn't have to be a question of arayot or a shetish or nida. It can also be, sometimes even pots and pans can be a serious psak the minute that it requires any kind of thought. The minute that you require, it's something's off the page, as it were, that should raise a very serious spiritual issue for us. And that's another thing that a posek needs to know. What modality and what state of mind you go about paskening shailot. And it's based on the Gemara that everyone knows, but I want to take a look at exactly how it plays out. Gemara in Avodah Zarah, Daf Yud Amud Bet, Amar Rabbi Abba, Amar Rav Huna, Amar Rav, Mai dichtiv ki rabim chalalim hipila, zet talmid shelo higia lahora u'moreh, v'atzumim kol harugeha.
Rabbi, sorry, where are you in the
I'm number two. I'm a number two.
Amar Rabbi Abba?
Amar Rabbi Abba. Amar Rav Huna Amar Rav. My dichtiv, it's a pasuk in Tilim. Ki rabim chalalim hipila, a person goes and he killed a lot of people. Zed talmid shelo igila horaá umoreh. It's a person who's not qualified. And he starts paskening. Look, I don't have to tell you that there are lots of people that walk around calling themselves rabbi, and they may have, passed exams or whatever, that they're not exactly higia lahora. They say all kinds of things, and they cause trouble for the people who really know how to learn. And it's a lot of kavod, and people expect, if you know a little bit more than the next guy, they expect you to know everything. I mean, it's not simple, but that's a very serious problem. I'm going to talk about the image in a sec. Vatsumim kol harugeha zet talmid shehigia lahora'ah ve'eino moreh. Kama ad mem shnei. All right, so the Gemara says that you're 40 years old. I'm not going to go into that right now. I want to call your attention simply to the language that Rav, because it's a member of Rav, the language that Rav uses here. Okay. I don't have to tell you that when we learn Torah, it's not like learning literature and so on. We are taking the neshama in our hands. So it's a double responsibility. Responsibility number one, we're obligated not to misrepresent God's word. Number two, we are obligated to make sure that we give as good an answer as possible, because, as I say, if we make a mistake, we're causing somebody else to sin. Now, sin is not a category because it's psychology, it's this, it's that, but it's a sin. And if we cause somebody to sin, then we are machshil them. It's a issue of lifnei evil atiten mechshol. So as a result, if you're not, so it's like a doctor. If a medical student is not allowed to give out prescriptions. If a medical student does that, he's liable to kill somebody. But the doctor, the worst he can do is to kill the person in olam hazeh. We could do worse and even hurt the person in olam. The thing that we are required to do. That's number one. Number two. Notice, however, that if you had to choose, asking Rabbi, he interprets these psukim because he didn't have to do it this way. What's worse? A person who's not qualified, questions for somebody for that is asked, or a person who is qualified out of modesty, false modesty, or out of fear of making a mistake, withholding information, what's worse? In other words, the information, the Torah to try. Now, at what stage do you know when you pass from the other? So then we could talk about that for a couple of hours. But the principle, it remains there. Interestingly, when you look at the Rambam here obviously was more bothered by unqualified rabbis, unqualified people giving all kinds of information than qualified rabbis withholding. It says, "V'kol talmid shelo higia lahora'ah umoreh harei rasha shoteh v'gas ruach. B'alav ne'amar ki rabim chalalim hipila. V'chein chacham," same din, "shehigia lahora'ah ve'eino moreh harei ze monea Torah v'noten mechshalot lifnei ha'ivrim. B'alav ne'amar v'atzumim kol harugeha." So far, so good. But then the Rambam goes off on a tear against rabbis who are unqualified, giving paskening shilas. Elu atalmidim aktanim shalu hirbu Torah karaui, vehem mevakshim litgadel b'fnei am haaretz uben anshei Iram, v'koftzim b'yoshvim barosh ladinu lahorot b'Yisrael, hem hamarbim hamachloket, vehem hamachrivim metaula. You can see what he's bothered by. והמכבים נרה של תורה והמחבלים כרם השם צבקות עליהם אמר שלמה בחוכמתו אחזו לנו שואלים קטנים מחבלים כרמים. Assuming, I'm going to assume that none of us here are shoalim ktanim mechablim kramim. So the point is that it's one of the things you have to know is before we get involved in psika, that it's something which is very loaded. By the way, that's one of the reasons I forgot to put this on the sources. There's a whole discussion. Interesting. It's one of these places where sometimes you have to read the what's it called? The small print. So in Siman Reish Mem Bet, where in Kvod Talmud Chacham in Yeridea, so the Shulchan Aruch discusses the whole question of Moreh Halacha B'fnei Rabo. So on the side, the Berchei Yosef, the Chidah, the whole Chidah is not printed there, but it's in further. If you take a look at the Chidah in the separate book, you'll see it's much extent. He says that he doesn't think Bisman Hazeh that there's such a thing as a din of Rov Chachmato Shemei Adam. He thinks that we learn mostly from books, and therefore you should look things up. The bottom line of that is, so that's very nice, but the other side of that means that you should never, because of it's.
Sorry, Rabbi, could you repeat the Chidah? I'm the translator.
The Chidah says that
the
Chidah says the din, even if you have smicha, he says the Chidah says that the din of Moreh Halacha B'fnei Rabo doesn't really apply to human beings anymore, because most of what we learn comes from books, and therefore before you answer a sheila, you should look it up, even if you think you remember, because that's you have to get permission from the books. Rav Soloveitchik thought that he didn't know about that. He thought that when the Anshe Knesset Agdolah said Hevum Betunum Badin, that means that if a Baal Bayit or somebody asks you a sheila, certainly if it's a complicated sheila, calls you up, you say, "Excuse me, I need to look it up, but give me a second, whatever. Don't off the top of your head." Okay, that's not proper. It's either a problem of Hevum Betunum Badin, it's a problem in the Gufa Psak, or there's an Isser of Asur Lahorod Halacha B'fnei Rabo. It's also true, by the way, especially as we get older, people who are very smart have a tendency to remember things not as they're written. I mean, not everybody is Chacham Ovadia Zatzal or Busher Weiss, depending on who you want to talk about. They can sit there and rattle off all of Shas and Poskim from the top of their heads. The rest of us mortals, we have a tendency not to, or to miss something. So it's also a question of responsibility. So that's point number 2. I'm not going to. I do want to, because we only have an hour, and I do want to make sure that we get to the other things. I gave you over here 2 passages. One is a tshuva from the beginning of a tshuva of the Maharil in the late 14th, early 15th century, in which for this is the introduction to a tshuva, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. The introduction is 9 lines. Of the 9 lines, 7 of them, the Maharil says, "I'm nobody, I'm nothing, I don't know anything, I don't have a right to talk, and whatever, but still I'll tell you my opinion." So at first you sit there and say, well, that's pretty funny, right? Okay, I'm such a gorn, I'm such a nothing, and yet I'm going to give my opinion. But it's really more than that. And yes, some Rabbanim write that way because that's what they're supposed to write. But it really is something. The paragraph, the introduction, the Maharil writes, really reflects the quandary that we are faced with when we paskin. On the one hand, the enormity and the severity and the importance of what we're doing. And on the other hand, we don't have a choice. We don't have a choice. We have to try. So that's basically what comes up in this Maharil. A famous example of this, and I really do very, very strongly recommend that you read it in full, is found in the introduction of Rabbi Moshe Feinstein to the first volume of Igrot Moshe. Now, Rabbi Moshe Rav Moshe was a very much a Lithuanian, so he did not. His style of psak is different than other Ashkenazim, and certainly than others than Chachamim Mizrachim. He was almost the polar opposite of the of Chacham Ovadia, for example, and certainly different than Rabbi Yosef Masas and others. Still, he does recognize the fact that there is a problem, and there are reasons to hesitate not from offering your opinion. But he says, nevertheless, the moral obligation of a person to try, if you're qualified, to try and to spread Torah overcomes that. So here he says, for example, this is on page 2. אבל הוא מטעם שהנכון לעניות דעתי, בזה שהיו רשאים ומחויבים חכמי דורות האחרונים להורות אף שלא היו נחשבים הגיע להוראה בדורות חכמי הגמרא. I mean, you can't sit there and say, I'm not Rabbi Akiva Eiger, or I'm not Rava, or Abaye, whatever. שיש ודאי לחוש, אולי, it's true, you always should be concerned that maybe you made a mistake. אולי לא כיוונו אמיתות הדין, כפי שהוא האמת כלפי שמיא, אבל האמת להוראה כבר נאמר לא בשמיים היא. You do the best you can. God doesn't intervene, so we don't know what exactly he wants, but if you learn properly, you put together the psak properly, and you do all your homework, and you do all of your applications the way you think, and it's a reasonable psak, then it's lo bashamayim. אלא כפי שנראה לחכם אחרי שעיין כראוי לברר ההלכה, בש"ס ובפוסקים, כפי כוחו, בכובד ראש. This is knows all these things that I mentioned before, בכובד ראש, ובירא מהשם יתברך, ונראה לו שכן הוא פסק הדין, הוא האמת להוראה, ומחויב להורות כן. אף אם בעצם גליה כלפי שמיא שאינו כן הפירוש, it may be אחרי 120, he'll get to heaven, and God will say, you know what, over here you made a mistake. But he tried, and he did the best you could, and that's what lo bashamayim he. ועל כזה נאמר שגם דבריו דברי אלוקים חיים, מאחר שלא נראה פירוש כמו שפסק. He was convinced that he was right. ולא היה סתירה לדבריו, and he didn't contradict anything major. ויקבל שכר על הוראתו, אף שהאמת אינו כפירוש. Okay, so that's point number 2. Point number 3. What else does a posek have to know? So here I'm going to just mention in passing. These are 2 paragraphs from the Rambam's Perush, the Hakdamah Perek Chelek, where the Rambam goes through the three different approaches, attitudes towards drashot and agadot Chazal. And that's really not it's really not germane to our discussion right this second. It'll be more relevant next week, but I wanted to just at least mention it here in passing. The Rambam here talks about the fact that there are darshanim who are not able. He talks about taking things literally, but what he basically is, what the Rambam is saying is there are darshanim who, when they interpret midrashim and agadot, they do so in a way which is inexplicable, incomprehensible to their audience. And so they say all kinds of things which may actually be legitimate, but because they can't explain them in ways that the audience can hear, because the audience doesn't speak Torah language, you're going to end up making a potential chilul Hashem. Take a look what. So he says, for example, count down 1. This is number 3. Count down 1, 2, 3, 4. 3. I'm sorry. Things which are a little bit odd, just incomprehensible. Ad kedei she'im tisaprenu kipshuto lahamon ha'am kol shekain liyichidehem. The intelligent people hayu nidhamin bekach. Vormim heyach efshar sheyeh ba'olam adam shemedameh dvarim elu v'choshev shehem dvarim nechonim v'kol shekain shimtzeu chen be'einav. והכת הזו המסכנה רחמנות על שכלותם, לפי שהם רוממו את החכמים לפי מחשבתם, ואינם אלא משפילים אותם בתכלית השפלות, ואינם מרגישים בכך, וחי השם, כי הכת הזו מאבדים הדר התורה ומחשיכים זוהרה, ועושים את תורת השם בהפך המכוון בה, Now watch. Lefisha Hashem amar al chuchmat Torato asher yishmu'un et kol hachukim ha'ela v'amru rak am navon v'chacham hagoy hagadol hazeh v'kat hazot dorshim b'pishtei divrei chachamim dvarim she'im yishmu ma'amim yomru rak am sachal v'naval hagoy hakatan hazeh. In other words, you may have the right schora, but if you can't explain it properly, if you don't speak the same cultural language that your audience speaks or the person that you're talking to speaks, you're going to not only not get them to do what they're supposed to do, it's going to end up becoming Chilul Hashem. Now that is a serious issue today because of the fact that many of the assumptions of Western society, the stuff that people get hit at all the time from TV and from media and from social media and from Facebook, God help us, or whatever, are the opposite of what the Torah stands for. So if we don't know how to formulate things and to present them in a way which that person can understand or show what general consensus and values are against the Torah and why they're wrong, then you're going to end up making a Chilul Hashem, and it'll be the opposite of what you intended. And certainly in a lot of areas of psak, especially when it comes to women's issues, but not only, this is a serious thing. So one of the things we need to know is how to do that. One of the skills that we need to know is to learn how to, I'm sorry if I'm using the word, I mean, I can't help it. We have to learn how to market. It's very simple. It's marketing Torah. I remember once many years ago, somebody approached me and asked me if I wanted to go in and work and join his business selling computers. So I said, what do I know about computers? What marketing? What do I don't know anything. So he looked at me and says, you market the hardest thing in the world. Next to Torah, computers is nothing. But the point is well taken. The point is very well taken. In the second part of this passage, the Rambam then says that you're going to have most problems with people that are sophisticated in their own eyes, and they make fun of the Torah because they think they're smarter. But we'll come to that later. So that's another thing we need to know. Okay. Now we're getting down to the. Now we'll get down to the nitty-gritty. This is, without a doubt, in my opinion, one of the most important letters the Chazon Ish ever wrote. It's really not a letter. It's according to the Kovetz Igrot Chazon Ish, according to Rav Greinemann Zatzal, who was Rav Chazon Ish's brother-in-law. According to him, it was they found this lying around in the Chazon Ish's house. But I'm glad that they printed it because it's a very important passage. Birur mishpat bivchinat halacha l'maaseh. How do you go about paskening? Nechalek liyunim shnayim. In other words, basically, there are two stages to the act of psak. Ha'iyun harishon, the first thing you have to do, the first part of your homework, first part of your research. Lahanif hasolet hanaki, to go through the fine flour. Sifei mishpat toriyim, you go through the rishonim, achronim, gemara rishonim, achronim, poskim. B'charav iyun hasheni. That's the fun part. That's the fun part. That's the part we all like, because you sit there and you sit and you analyze and you argue, and it's Torah Lishma, and that part's great. Then comes part two. What's part two? B'charav iyun hasheni hachadira beha'uvda hanochachat lefanenu, is the analysis of the case in front of us. B'ma'aloteha, with its advantages, u'migraoteha, and its downsides, u'b'diuk mishkal shel kol perek miparkeha, breaking it down into its component parts. K'dei lahat'im et hanidon el seif ha'halacha mechuvan alav, because after you worked out all the possibilities, now you got to figure out exactly where all of the various component parts of the sheila come into play. And part two is much harder because you come up with all the svarot, and you learned every wild rishon and every interesting achron you ever saw in your life, and you come home feeling really good. But now you got to figure out exactly how it fits, and there are angles to every she'elah, which are different. That's the reason why we don't follow precedent. Halacha never follows precedent because no two cases are the same. There may be, they might be relevant to use it, but there's always a wrinkle. Because this, I mean, it's like the old question about, the little story about the rich woman with the chicken and the poor woman with the chicken. So here you can be machmir, and there you can, it's efsed meruba. Yeah, every single case, we don't do mechanical psak. That's another one of the challenges we'll see in a few minutes in terms of contemporary psak, because you've got smart aleck guys who think that who went to yeshiva for 5-6 years, and they'll go and ask Rabbi Google, and Rabbi Google will tell them this is what they said, and that's it. But it's not. The psak is an art form. Developing the chadut hariyah, the tfiat ayin, the ability to be able to notice the nuances of each case in terms of the case itself, and I don't care if it's a pot or a pan, or it's a question of mara hanida, or it's a question of this is pesach dik or not, or whatever the case may be, doesn't matter, or the person who asks. All of that changes from place to place. And by the way, my wife likes to always point out to me, I like to always be accommodating. My wife likes to point out that sometimes you want to be able to be makel, you want to be help. Rav Ovadia used to always say the koach tetera adif. But you know what? Sometimes the questioner, if you look at them really straight in the eye, they want you to be machmir. So it's not so simple. All right? Satama kozebet me'amichsholim b'yesod halacha. Even if a person doesn't make the dayan doesn't make a crazy mistake, he shall sif hayadua be'et shehalim ayin mi. Can't see what this is. Oh, in makom mediocre, I guess. Mikirei Rav ha'erech b'fliliyah ha'mishpat hanivna tamid al kavim sheklaliyim dakim uvahalamad zo hotzi mishpat mu'ukal mu'uvat lo yuchal zaken. It's a very precise art, and you gotta be very, very careful. Uvishel ha'yun okay. Uvishel ha'yun ha'acharon. This is if he knew, but it's as if the Chazon Ish knew about Rabbi Google. Uvishel ha'iyun ha'acharon, because of the complexity of that last of the second part of the application, nishlela ha'horaá min ha'amon af b'dvarim sha'asur v'amutar mefursam tachlit ha'pirsum v'nitna lechachamim shebechol dor lechakot לאשורה של כל שאלה המופיעה מזמן לזמן שחכמים יפתרוה מנקודת עיון מקיף הסתכלות בחירה. So number one, it means you need shimush. It's only by getting shimush Talmid Chachamim you can learn to develop this kind of careful perception. But beyond that, it's a fact that in general, this is the reason why Balabatim were not, why there's a huge polemic, a long history of polemic among skim from at least from the 15th century on, especially once printing was started, against writing. When the Agur was published, it was a very fancy problematic guy. But it was a posek, a darshan in Venice, whose name was Rav Leo Yehuda Aryeh Modena. So Modena was he was a posek, he was a darshan, and he writes in one place that one of his balabatim went up to him and said, "You know what, Rabbi, I don't need you anymore, because now I got the Shulchan Aruch, which it's not the Shulchan Aruch we know. It's this little book, you can stick it in your pocket. It's like a little kahati, right? I don't need you anymore. I got the whole thing's here, and I don't need you." That's why poskim didn't like the Shulchan Aruch. Happy with the Chayei Adam. That's why, I mean, you've got this whole long tradition of yelling and screaming about popular books. It's one of the reasons why a lot of poskim didn't like Shmirat Shabbat Kehilchata. It's not because of all the kulot in the first edition, which was also an issue, but because the whole idea. In fact, I don't know if the story heard it from somebody who should know. That somebody asked the Chafetz Chaim, why didn't you write on your Yoredeya? I mean, as long as you're whatever. Chafetz Chaim, according to if you look in the art scroll type books, they'll say the Chafetz Chaim say, nah, I did, but it took me so long to write the Mishnah Berurah, I didn't really have time to go do Yoredeya. First of all, so I hope that the Mishnah Berurah, Chafetz Chaim didn't say that, because it would not shed very good light on him. Because first of all, the first edition of the Mishnah Berurah was published in 1888. Chafetz Chaim died in 1934. So even though he apparently began to decline in the 20s, he still had 30 years to write on Yoredeya. So it's clearly that this is a dechia b'kash. Why? So I heard from my teacher, Professor Twersky, who heard from one of the members of the Chafetz Chaim's family, that the real issue was something else. That the real issue was that they didn't want to put Yoredeya in the hands of Balabata. And that was really the issue. Okay, so what do you need to know? So number one, we need to know is how to evaluate a case. What a posek needs to do is knowing stuff from the books is never enough. And this is proven, and where you find this played out beautifully is actually a Gemara in Brachot, which most people skip over. They don't really pay attention to how Chazal have tremendous sensitivity in terms of what they say. Gemara in the Brachot Daf Dalet Amud Aleph. The David Shamran of Shiki Chasidani. All right. David Melech is calling himself a Chasid. That's another issue. Levi Rabbi Yitzchak. Two traditions among the Amorei Eretz Yisrael how to interpret the pasuk. Chad amar, kach amar David lefnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Ribono shel Olam, lo chasidani, shekol malchei mizrach u'ma'arav yeshinim ad 3 sha'ot, v'ani chatzot laila akum lahodot lecha. So that's number one. He goes up to the he used to say Tilla. He used to write Tilla. The Idach and the other Amora, we don't know who holds what. Kach amar David lefnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Ribono shel Olam, lo chasidani, shekol malchei mizrach u'ma'arav yoshvim agudot b'chodam. They sit there on their thrones and they're looking like big shots, and they fan them and they bring them food and they dance and they sing. No, what do I do? Vani yadayim meluchlachot badam u'v'shvir u'v'shilya kedei letaher isha leba'ala. So number one, what do you see from this? You see from this that you can't paskin marot hanida. You can't paskin until you see how things play out in the world. Until you get your hands dirty with shver shilya, until you get in there and take a look at it and work in the shlacht house, or whether we're looking at trefot or whatever the case might be, all the book learning in the world is going to get you nowhere. There's a famous story about Reb Baruch Ber when he became the Rav in Kamenetz, at the same time as the yeshiva was there, that somebody brought him a korkovan, and the korkovan had a needle, and he didn't know which. He looked at this way, the other way, and they said, Rebbe, that's a korkovan. He said, oh, this is the holy korkovan, korkovan kadosh. Now it's a very cute story, but the point is that's wrong. That's wrong. You shouldn't presume to say anything until you've done the work in the trenches. And even David HaMelech, Yadai Melchot B'Dam B'Shvir V'Shilya Kedei L'Taher Isha L'Ba'ala. V'lo od. Now here comes a real shocker. Ela kol ma shani oseh ani nimlach b'Mefiboshet Rabbi. V'omer lo Mefiboshet Rabbi. Yafe danti, yafe chiyavti, yafe zikiti, yafe tiharti, yafe timeti, v'lo boshti. Now, Mephibosheth, you will recall, was the son of Yehonatan, meaning that, yes, he grew up in David HaMelech's house, but politically, he was the enemy. In the end, he ended up on the wrong side of the politics. However, And Chazal were very, and whoever the Amora was, I don't know if it was Levi or Rabbi Yitzchak, whichever one it was very well aware of that. Nevertheless, you go, if there's a person who knows better, that's the point. If there's a person who knows better, never hesitate to consult. I said about looking things up, all the more so, never hesitate to consult, especially the harder it gets, the more you should consult. If you take a look from the high Middle Ages on, this is true in North Africa as well as true in Italy, and it's true in Europe. Poskim, major poskim, I'm not talking about just the community rabbi. Major poskim make their psak halacha contingent upon the agreement of Aleph, Bet, and Gimel. There is absolutely no busha. There is no shame in consulting. On the contrary, ultimately it'll be your responsibility. But you seek out the person who knows your Mephibosheth, and you consult. Now this is especially true, and now we're getting into we're going to get into questions of areas of expertise, because Bisman Hazeh, there are very few poskim who are not experts. In other words, you have people like Reb Busher, who can talk about anything, or Chacham Ovadia Zatzal, or Rav Amar, who can paskin in any area of the Torah. But increasingly, you have people that are experts on certain things. So therefore, it behooves us to know to find out who the experts are and consult with them. I remember there was an old Hasidic Rebbe. He was the Helmetzer Rebbe. This is the world's expert on mikveh. He's a little guy, a short little guy. And he was, when they excavated Metzada in the 60s, and they found mikvaot that were put there by the Kanaim, so they sent for him. So he came running in his black coat, and Metzada, if those of you who've been know that it's always like 45 degrees in the shade there. So he's up there with his shtreimel and whatever, and he measured the mikvah, and he says it was a kosher mikvah, and very, very nice. Okay. The point is that everybody needs a Mephibosheth. So that's another thing to know. Seek out the people who have expertise in areas that you might not. Okay, maybe you'll become an expert. Could be, but that's how one learns. Now, aside from that, obviously, Shas and Poskim is in terms of things that you really should. They're areas where you need to get major or serious some basic expertise. So first of all, obviously, it's very, very important to already, when you're learning Shulchan Aruch, to start familiarizing yourself with Shelot Teshuvot. Now, you start with Shelot Teshuvot, there's no end to it. So what you have to decide is, in terms of your Masoret Avot, who are the major poskim? Who's in your, I don't say stable, who's in your pantheon? I know, for example, in my world, in the Lithuanian world, so I'm not going to go right. We don't go running to see what the what's his name? What all the Hungarians say. It's not one of the people you look up. I mean, I don't check the shutim of the Satmar Rebbe or of the Minchas Elazar, or I can look at it. I mean, Darké Tshuva is very important, but he's not at the top of the list, because everybody has their own. Everybody has their. Take a look at Rav Vadia. Rav Vadia certainly is not. He's not overly enamored of Lithuanians. In fact, he without mentioning him, he sits there and screams and yells at them in the introduction to almost every single volume of Yabia Omer, where he says all they sit and do is sit there and do pilpulim, and they don't know how to paskin aliba lasuke mishmatet aliba hilchata. It's a thing with him. If you take a look at the beginning, Rav Vadia in the beginning, I think it's volume 9, Tet or Yud of Yabia Omer, he sort of really gets on a tear in the Hagdama. So that's something else. But start familiarizing yourself with Tshuvot, because there's how you see where iyun starts translating into psak. And you've got, and happily there are a lot of theoretical discussions are available, especially online now in journals like Tchumin, which is even though it's Dati Leumi, because it comes out of actually around the corner from me in Alon Shvut, it actually is a place where all kinds of people publish. It's Haredi Poskim, also Rav Zalman Nechemia Zatzal used to publish there too, and they deal with really cutting edge issues. For example, in the last couple of issues of Tchumin, they've had long discussions about the status of a big polemic about the status of what's it called, test tube meat. Now, I frankly, I mean, I think it should be. I think personally, not that I'm opposed to it, but I think that it should be. I think it should be Fleshek B'Sari the Rabbanan. I can't believe, having had steaks in Mexico City, I honestly cannot believe that anything that they do in a lab can come close to some of the grills that I got to eat in your neck of the woods. But that's that kind of, and all of these journals are online. Sometimes you have to pay for them, but it's worth it. Tchumin Asya deals with medical issues. To be able to keep on top of things, it's something to really know what the people in the various fields are doing. Now, okay, I'm gonna, since I don't have a lot of time, there are, but even if you're not going to become an expert, there are certain areas that it's very important to get a basic understanding, or to find people who can give it to you. In other words, people to whom you can consult. For example, Shlomo Zalman Auerbach used to have, there were two or three doctors who were very close with him, and they would sit and teach him medicine, so that he could rule the way that he the rule, Paskin, whatever came up. Similarly, Rabbi Tendler, Yibad L'chaim Tov Baruchim, Ramesha used to consult with his son-in-law, Rabbi Tendler, professor of biology, or his grandson, Yaakov Tendler, was a doctor. But still, if you're going to specialize, you really need, there are certain areas of secular studies that are necessary for responsible psak. For example, basic chemistry. Basic chemistry in terms of issues of how chemicals break down, how additives break down, what role they play in the creation of whatever they put into food in terms of kashrut. You don't have to get a BA in chemistry, but a certain basic understanding of how chemistry works and how things are, how chemicals work in food additives, or in food. There's a whole area called food chemistry, which I think every Rav should, especially if you're going to get to hashgacha, there's no question, has to know. It's one of the things you can learn on your own. I don't know if any of you know but he used to come to Mexico a lot. My friend Rav Oren Duvdevani. Rav Oren is self-taught. He doesn't have a BA in chemistry, but there's nothing in kashrut he doesn't know. There's not a food additive that he hasn't heard of, and he knows exactly how they work because he's acquired that kind of knowledge. You're going to have to know something about electronics and electric engineering, because increasingly questions about LEDs and the whole question about I'm sure it's already come up. The only country in the world that still has mechanical keys in the doors in hotels is Israel. Everywhere else works with the magnetic cards, and whether you can use them on Shabbat and Chag is a thing. Reb Nachum Rabinovich Zatzal said that using the cards was okay, but he had a degree in mathematics and developed for himself an expertise in electronics. But again, it's one of the things you can learn enough to be able to be an intelligent layman and ask the right questions, and then talk to the experts. That's really how it has to. It's about acquiring literacy, so you can ask the right questions. The ability to ask the right questions then let you teach you how to translate the concepts in the poskim to the to the case at hand. A friend of mine suggested if you're going to be a dayan, knowing something about economics, micro and macroeconomics, and secular law. I don't think that's a. I don't know if there's any. Is there a? I don't think there's any beit din in the world that doesn't have lawyers attached to them to be able to make sure that, especially since most but they didn't work on the basis of borurut, on the basis of not arbitration. What's the word? Quick, not arbitration. No, well, maybe it's arbitration. Yeah, arbitration. So you need to know exactly what goes and what doesn't go. Very important for every single Rav is basic psychology, especially pastoral psychology and counseling. Now that's important in terms of evaluating the people that ask you questions. Now, first of all, most of what we do as Rabbanim has got to do with being nice to people and doing things for them that they need and giving them what they need when they come to tell us their problems. That anyway, but a background in counseling, whether it's a certificate in counseling or whether it's a degree in counseling or in psychology, it's critical in also to understand when you have a VaDaat Torah, the people in front of you. I mean, that's what the Chazon Ish was talking about. Some people are born with that kind of critical ability to be able to evaluate people's motives, but sometimes not. It's really, 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 really important, and it's also important in terms of, again, marketing the psak. How do you tell people things? This comes up especially at life cycle events. And I was gonna jump and talk about a avelut, but I'll tell you a case that I had that had nothing to do with avelut, but required a certain amount of counseling knowledge. Many years ago, I had a case where I was invited. It was whatever. I was invited to a brit, and the baby, as it turned out, I don't know why they didn't know this before this, but the baby, as it turned out, when the mohel came, took one look, and it turns out it was a case of hypospadias, which is the case, if you know the situation, where the hole in the aver is misplaced, and sometimes that has to be done surgery. Sometimes you have to do the brit in the home, because what they do is they use the orla to reconstruct the aver. So that's a medical issue, but you need to know how to counsel to be able to take shocked parents, especially a mother, and teach them, calm them down, and to present things in a way that can be understood. I listed here basic sociology, cultural trends, history, internet, and databases. That's got all of those have to do with what we talked about, marketing, and in terms of contemporary challenges. To psak and how to deal with them. We're going to talk about that next week. But I in the list, I wanted to make sure they were there. I do want to call your attention to the fact that there are, for those of you who don't know, that there are 4 or 5 major important tools which, properly used, once you have the proper shimush, you really have to know about. So number 1, obviously, is the Bar-Ilan Responsa database, which, I mean, it's really I find it incredibly humbling that everything is on this little nothing. They have not only put in a Morse form that you'd ever know to do with, but also decisions of the Batei Din in Yerushalayim, and as well as not a few Torah journals. So it's a very important tool. If you can get online access or get one, it's worth the investment. I can't emphasize that enough. With that, Otzar Chachma, which is online, that's very expensive. Otzar Chachma is every book that ever was, and if it's not an Otzar Chachma, it's for free on HebrewBooks.org. At least you should always know that the Sfarim that you need are available. However, the problem with all of these things, just like I talked about Rabbi Google, is the fact that a lot of people, a lot of Balabatim, whoever yeshiva background, think that, just I can put in a search to the Bar-Ilan project, I'll have all my answers, and that's it. That's not true. First of all, it's a little bit dishonest because you don't always come up with everything you need. Second of all, we know that the whole Torah, Kol Torah Kula is the Damot Milta Milta. And sometimes when you have a reference that comes up in the that the posek didn't excluded something when in fact might be relevant for your case. So there's no substitute for broad learning, and there's no substitute for analysis, and there's no such thing as Torah from a machine. I will add, however, that a lot of Torah journals are online, and you should familiarize with yourself to see what there is. Now there is another database which is called Kotar, Kaf Vav Taf Resh. Now there are two. If you go online, you'll see that there are two databases called Kotar. One is called Kotar HaSifriya HaMekuvenet Shel Yisrael. Kotar meaning it's basically an online library in Hebrew. That's not the one you want. The other one, the other Kotar is a huge database of Torah journals. And all of them have not just iyunim, binyan this, binyan that, binyan the other thing, but also they have halacha l'maaseh. So, Adkan, we said an hour, and it's exactly an hour. I'm on a roll, but if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer because I'm not tired.
Yes, please. I have a question. Could you please explain why it's important to know what the person asking wants to hear?
Because sometimes a person comes to ask you a question, and you, if most people, their natural inclination is to be makel, but sometimes people want it to be a sword. They want to feel like they're doing a little bit more. They want to be machmir. It gives them. I'm not encouraging across the boards chumras. We'll talk about chumrot next week, but sometimes they want to feel like they want it to be a sword. The act of part of Torah is sacrificing, and there are cases where people want to feel like they said, good, so sir, I can't do it. I don't. Sometimes you can even tell from the way the person asks that they really don't want to do something, and if it could be possibly a sword, then then you're giving them what they want. So for example, a person, I'm making this up. A person wants to person's in Shloshim. Person's in Shloshim, and they're invited to a wedding, and they want to know if she go to the wedding. And so, what's it? Me personally. So I try to be nice. So so I start with with Rav Moshe, and you can help to serve the dishes, and then whatever, and then you walk out for the music, so you can be there. But if a lot of the times you look at this person, and the person's asking the question, maybe they've been asked to ask, and it's clear that they're really very broken over the fact the person that they're in mourning for, and they really don't want to go. So, in such a case, and even though halacha can make kelba'avol, right? Still, maybe don't go. And so you'll give them a reason to be able to say, my rabbi said I can't go. Now you probably could have worked out a heter, but the person needed not to go. His avelut is such that he doesn't need the avelut. He doesn't need the heter. He needs to mourn. You follow? So it's something like that. That would be one example.
Right. Thanks.
Anybody else?
Rabbi, they are asking if you could write in the chat the Kotara website.
Oh, okay. Hold on. You
Or,
know what?
how it is spelled. Okay. Yeah, Rab Marcos.
No. Hold on. Wait. So first, I can do this with Toch today. I'm going to stop share. And no. I'll show you how absolutely, what's the word? Absolutely proficient I am in the world of, give me a second. Kotar. Oh, no. What's this? Just a sec. Okay, I'm gonna hold on a second. I'm putting it on the chat now. Okay, there it is. Now there might be a small registration fee. I get it through the university. Okay, Beseder. All right, it's been a pleasure. We will see you, Mirza Hashem, next week.
רבי ג'פרי, יש לי שאלה.
כן.
אם זה כל כך חשוב שרב ידע ידיעות בסיסיות בתרבות, בהיסטוריה, בטכנולוגיה, למה בכוללים לא מכניסים פרוגרם או לא מכניסים לימודים שיכולים לעזור לאברכים, שיהיה להם ידע כללי, בסיסי, בנושאים חשובים שקשורים להלכה?
Okay, so the answer...
יש כוללים שעושים את זה? אני לא יודע.
יש, ארץ חמדה עושים את זה, אבל... Okay, let's look at. There is a tremendous, since the 19th century, since the beginning of the Haskalah, for good reason, there has been a tremendous amount of suspicion towards any kind of secular knowledge. And as a result, not suspicion, even hostility towards secular knowledge, even knowledge that's necessary for Psak Halacha, which is kind of odd, because if you look in the Rishonim and even the Achronim, even when there was a ban against studying philosophy, for example, when there was a cherem against philosophy, if you take a look at the cherem against philosophy in the time of the Rashba, for example, it's in Shut HaRashba, Chelek Aleph, medicine is explicitly exempted. There's a lot of suspicion. The fear is that you're exposed to secular knowledge. It'll undermine one's emunah. I always thought personally that that's why you should teach it in a Torah context and not learn on the outside. But all right, my shigon. But I don't know any poskim who do not acquire basic knowledge of most of at least all of these things, either by their own reading or by learning these things from experts. As I said, you don't need to. You don't need to get a PhD in chemistry to be literate or to be responsible in terms of food additives and.
אבל רב ג'פרי, סליחה שאני מפריע ומפסיק, אבל אני מרגיש איך אני למדתי בכולל 15 שנה, אוקיי? ומה שאני רוצה לשאול זה, כשלא מרגילים אברכים שזה דבר חשוב, אחר כך, כשהם גודלים, יש להם בתוך תוכם הרגשה שזה ביטול תורה, ושזה דבר פסול, ושזה דבר שלילי, וממילא לא נותנים את הפרופורציה הנכונה, ואת הכובד, ואת הרצינות לנושא, כי כל הזמן חוששים שהמדענים משוגעים, וחושבים שהרופאים רשעים, וחושבים שההיסטוריה מזויפת, ואף פעם לא שמים רצינות לשום ידע, וכל הזמן חוששים, והפסקים שלהם בנויים או בנויות על ידיעות חלקיות, אינטרפרטציות שלהם, וכל מיני דברים. האם אני טועה או לא טועה?
תשמע, תראה את הסיפור העצוב הזה של הקורונה. לא צריך יותר מזה.
וכשמלמדים קטנים, מקטנות, כחלק מהנושאים שלומדים בבית ספר, בישיבה, בכולל, אז זה נהיה חלק מהחיים שלך, ואתה מעורב בזה, וזה ממש גישה אחרת.
So you could argue the other way. You could argue that it's important not to expose younger kids to it and wait till a person's an avrech or whatever, that they're already solid and so on. And you have the right teachers to do it. I mean, look at the leaders of the people that they made a point of having Talmidei Chachamim who were doctors be the ones who were trying to convince certain people in Bnei Brak, for example, that corona is dangerous because they had credibility. And there's reason to suspect scientists. There's reason to suspect some doctors because there is hostility against religion in the secular world in general, and certainly among scientists, because they don't make a distinction between what's called science and scientism. Science is mada. That's just science. It's objective, whatever it is. Scientism is a religion based on the idea that science can solve all of our problems. That's an avodah zarah. And a lot of scientists don't make that distinction, but there are enough religious, yirei shamayim that can serve as advisors for, to provide the information for Talmidei Chachamim who need this information to be able to properly evaluate the situation the way the Chazon Ish had it. I know that in yeshivot there's stories about this gadol and that gadol who used to give specific instructions to surgeons and to scientists and to doctors, and they had no secular background. Believe it or not believe it, I don't know, but many of the stories you hear are from the Lubavitcher Rebbe, but the Lubavitcher Rebbe had a degree in electronic engineering. It means he had a science background, so it's he could be able to. He was literate in these regards. It's a narrow path, but I don't understand how else you can paskin that way. All right, you know what? As long as we're at it, I'll show you. Let's look at. I was going to take a look at this. There is a famous exchange between Reb Moshe Isserlis and his cousin, Marshal, Reb Shlomo Luria. They were first cousins. I don't know if anybody knows that. Reb Moshe Isserlis was very interested in, he was what's called a polymath. He was interested in all kinds of things. And among the things he did was he was very emphatically devoted to the Rambam. He learned Ma'amar Nevuchim Shabbat afternoon. So in a tshuva, which we don't have actually, he was faced with a problem of certain types of growths on the lungs of a cow. Those of you who learned Elu Trefot, you know, there's Tinri and Gildi and all these other different types of things that can happen to a cow's lungs. So he was trying to figure out what the nature of a certain type of growth on the cow's lung is. And he referred to Aristotle's biology to try to diagnose whether the animal with whatever this defect was, whether it's trefa or not. So somebody brought this tshuva to the Marshal, and the Marshal lost it. He just got furious, and he writes. He was 10 years older than the Ramah, so he writes to his little cousin, Moshe, and he says, "What's the matter with you?" So it's a long exchange between the two of them. This is Siman Vav, but it's just 3 lines. He says, "V'achar kach heritani michochmat aristo ha'arel mitoch ha'edim sheba'aretz. Amarti oili sheinai ra'u nosaf lama she'oznai shamu she'ikar ha'machmad v'abosim u'divrei ha'tamei." Most of what your argument is based on the divrei ha'tamei. It wasn't clear whether he was more upset because it was Arel or Tamei, Aristotle. V'yihi b'fi chachmei Yisrael ke'ayin bosim l'torah k'dosha rachmana litzlan me'avon. You're using Aristotle in a Torah context. What's the matter with you? And he yells and he screams and If he were talking about straight philosophy, I could hear the question, but I'm always stunned, and I don't have an answer. But I'm always stunned by the Marshal here, because the Ramah was trying to figure out, based on the science of his day, whether a growth on a lung renders an animal treif or not. It wasn't that. So obviously the Marshal's position was nothing from the outside should be taken into consideration when it comes to psak halacha. Now this is the polar opposite of the Rambam. The Rambam, this comes up all over the place, but this is I think his most famous formulation in Shmona Prakim, in the Hakdama Shmona Prakim. He says, "Bra'iti lakdim kodem shatchil befirush halacha prakim mo'ilim." Halacha, he was referring to the Mishnayot and Pirkei Avot. Prakim mo'ilim yuzgu la'adam mehem hakdamot v'yu lo gam ken kemaftech lema shanu atidim lefaresh. V'da כי הדברים אשר אומר אותם באלו הפרקים ובמה שיבוא מן הפירוש אינם עניינים שחידשתים אני מעצמי ולא פירושים שבדיתם, אלא הם עניינים לוקטים מדברי החכמים במדרשות ובתלמוד בזולתו בחיבוריהם ומפי הפילוסופים גם כן הקדומים והחדשים וחיבורי הרבה בני אדם ושמע האמת ממי שאמרה. So you've got 2 drachim. Now the truth of the matter is that in general, now again, my bekiyut in Poskates from Africa and Syria and Iraq is limited. However, bigadol, at least historically, Ashkenazim are the ones who were always allergic to talking to doctors and talking to scientists. And Chachmei HaMizrach were always much more open to it. For the simple reason that otherwise, how will you know whether this growth on the lung is kasher or not? You have to know what the facts are, the Chazon Ish says, and then you'll figure out which sieve to attach it to. But again, as I said, the Ashkenazim have been allergic to anything secular way back, and in this regard, the Ramah is much more of is something of an outlier. I think we pay a price for not having that amount of basic. It's like you don't need. It's true. My son likes to put it this way. So, a lot of the things that they want Haredim, for example, to go to work at involve a certain amount of physics. I'm talking about here in Israel. And now there's theoretical physics and there's applied physics. What we're talking about is applied physics, for which you don't need to know theoretical physics. Why am I saying this? Because theoretical physics is full of kfira. But applied physics is applied physics. It's like, like being an electrician. When a person is an electrician, he uses science. But you can be a Yehudi Yerei Shamayim and be an electrician. The two don't contradict. So that's what we're talking about over here, and we can make that and that distinction can be can be made. And again, we're talking about sufficient literacy to be able to ask the experts the right questions, and then your job, because you're the expert in Torah, is to make that jump. But if you don't know what to ask, if you don't have enough, involvement in these things, how are you going to be able to? If you take a look, for example, take a look at in Minchat Shlomo. Oh boy, I forget it was Chelik Aleph, Chelik Bet. Rabbi Shlomo Zal, they reprinted Rabbi Shlomo Zalman's Kuntres Moreh Ha'esh, in which he discusses electricity, and he basically goes and he seriously attacks the Chazon Ish's opinion that electricity is asur mishum bona, because of the closing of the circuits. But you got to know about circuits. The Chazon Ish learned about circuits. Rabbi Shlomo Zalman talked to physicists about how electricity works. If you know how electricity works, how are you going to know whether it's Eish or not? I mean, I don't know when Chaim Ezer said that Chashmal is Eish, I don't know who he talked to, but I'm pretty sure he didn't just say off the top of his head. So this is so yes, the dangers are there, but then you have to sit there and weigh, and we're not and for whom and how and under what circumstances. But if you don't know how to ask the right question, how are you going to know how to give the right answer? Certainly, we're talking about poskim.
תודה רבה. תזכה למצוות.
Okay, we'll see you next week, Mirza Hashem, and have a Shabbat Shalom, everybody.
Shabbat Shalom, מרתק. תודה רבה.
Shalom, thank you.
תודה רבה.
Shalom, thank you.